I'm Steve Cass, Chair of the Architecture Committee of the National Arts Club, and I'd like to welcome you here today to our program, Nature's Patterns and Design, a talk with Nikos Salingaros and Anne Sussman. This past year during COVID, the NAC has presented 150 programs online, covering a wide variety of topics across all the arts. Normally, we would be presenting them live from our clubhouse on Gramercy Park in New York City. And CDC and NYC guidance permitting, we'll be resuming that in September at the beginning of our fall season. Please join us for those. We plan to continue online programming as well alongside those, as it's been so popular. For our program, please submit questions as we go along through the Q&A. Our speakers will do their best to answer them. We'll also have a period at the conclusion of their talk for answering the remainder of the questions, as many as we can get to as time permits. Now, I'd like to introduce Architecture Committee Chairperson, Committee Member Mary Campbell Gallagher, who has arranged this program. She will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Nadine, and thanks to the National Arts Club. I am indeed a charter member of the Architecture Committee of the National Arts Club, which is a great committee. Thank you, Steve. And one of the things that is special at the National Arts Club is that we members plan the programs. This program has been especially pleasant for me to plan because I know that Nikos and Anne both have great messages. I have heard them both speak many times. Nikos is a mathematician who is one of the most distinguished observers and commentators on architecture and urbanism in the world. I have a special fondness for what he has said about a topic near to my heart, which is opposition to skyscrapers in Paris. We've got a book coming out on that subject. And Nikos is responsible for the wonderful observation about skyscrapers that engineers have never come up with a way of speeding how quickly people descend a staircase in case of a fire. Is that brilliant? Thank you, Nikos. Anne is a master of many things, a journalist, an architect, and now the proponent of a wonderful view of a wonderful set of views and approaches and disciplines about how we perceive architecture. So the overall question here tonight is, what is it that relates human beings to architecture? We all know that something does. And we all know that some places, some buildings are wonderful places. We want to be there. I will go out of my way to walk through Grand Central Terminal. And if it were possible, I would go out of my way to avoid walking through the Port Authority bus terminal. So some buildings are more friendly than others. And Nikos and Anne have a great contribution, I think, to make to this question. Why is it that some buildings are friendly, some are unfriendly, some raise us up, and some, unfortunately, we want to run away from? So, Steve, you were going to introduce the speakers, or should I let Nikos have the floor?
The floor is yours at the moment, Mary. Go ahead.
Okay, Nikos, please let us hear from you about what it is that relates human beings to our buildings. Nikos Salingaros.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Thank you for the invitation to talk. I have a few points that I'm going to present informally. And then we'll have Anne's presentation, which is more scientific and more detailed with slides and graphs. And then we'll have a free-for-all question and answer session. So I want to begin with human intelligence. How does human intelligence develop? Well, humans are very special animals because the human baby at birth has only 25% of its brain. And the 75% of the baby's brain develops right through to the 20s, the early 20s. So really, the development of human intelligence occurs outside the womb, 75% outside the womb, only 25% inside the womb. So what is it that nature expects the baby to increase its intelligence? What influences the baby to increase its intelligence? Well, a major component of that are the patterns that the baby experiences in the environment, because the human baby comes out, and our ancestors looked at the patterns in nature, and those during our evolution increased our intelligence. Now, way back, we have patterns which are fractal patterns, because plants are mostly fractals. What is a fractal? A fractal is a structure that has something on the size of a tree, and then the size of the main trunk, and then the size of the branches and the smaller branches, and the branches, smaller and smaller branches down to the leaves, size of the leaves, the articulation of the leaves, the veins in the leaves. See, I'm describing, you may know what a fractal is, but it's like, it's a hierarchy of scales getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So when we experience nature, we mostly experience the fractal patterns of nature, and these are essential to create the intelligence of the evolving human brain in the baby. This is, however, only one of many symmetries. Animals, which came after plants, animals have a bilateral symmetry. We have the face. We learn to recognize the face. The baby immediately recognizes the mother's face, more important than the father. It's the mother's face because the mother is going to give the milk. So this is a bilateral symmetry, which means it's reflectionally symmetric about a vertical axis. And remember that term, the vertical axis, because that's a gravitational axis. Animals walk. All animals walk, and they look from side to side. That defines the horizontal. And then therefore the reference is the vertical axis. So we have the fractal symmetries, which are scaling symmetries, which are things that occur at different scales, that you magnify something and you magnify it and you find more and more structure. And then you have what most people know as patterns, which are bilaterally symmetric, mirror symmetries. You also have translational symmetries, which you move in one direction and you have things lined up in a line. And then you have rotational symmetries, things going round and round. And usually we have a combination of hundreds or thousands of these symmetries. So what we call symmetry, what Anne and I are going to refer to symmetry, is not, say, a building that has a symmetric facade. No, that's the least important symmetry. What we refer to as symmetry are thousands and thousands of different types of symmetries occurring on different scales, and they're all interrelated and interconnected. So I began this talk by defining scaling symmetries, which are the same as fractal symmetries. So how do you see if something has a scaling symmetry? Well, you look at it, and then you magnify a piece of it, and then you take a piece of that and you magnify it, and take a piece of that and you magnify it. If it has fractal symmetry or scaling symmetry, then you will see something. Sometimes it's self-similar. Each time you magnify, it looks the same. That happens with some plants. It happens with cauliflowers when you look at it. So what I'm sketching a framework that the human brain needs to develop. And our neuroscience really evolved in order for us to be able to grasp the information contained in all these patterns. So the development of the human brain really is a recapitulation of the evolution over millions of years of humans, from more primitive animals to our intelligence. And you may say, well, what I'm talking about are visual patterns. Yes, but in humans, the visual system, the brain devotes an enormous percentage, a large percentage of its processing energy is devoted to visual patterns. So they're extremely important for us. This is not to downplay all the other means of information exchange, sound and song, and rhythm and smell and the tactile qualities. These are extremely important, but humans are biased towards the visual. That's why we're looking at patterns in nature. So what happens when we have an architecture that has gone on for 100 years that denies all of these patterns in nature? Does it affect the intelligence of the human race? Does it affect the intelligence of our babies? Unfortunately, we have very little data. Data from Romanian orphanages show that there are about 20 or 30 IQ points less at the diminution of the IQ of neglected orphans. Okay, so this is earth-shattering information. However, we need data because the orphans were not only denied the patterns that are necessary to develop the brains, they were denied affection and social interaction and sound and talking. So you cannot say how much of it is due to the visual patterns, which is the topic of this talk. However, we do have hard data from other animals. And let's not be so arrogant as to say that, you know, humans are godlike. No, we are another animal. Well, the experiments have been done with fish and with mice and with rats. And we see the results of raising babies of these animals in enhanced environments. And in this case, it's enhanced visual environments where you have patterns, where you have a rich texture and patterns, visual patterns in the environment. And the brain increases like 20% versus the minimalist environments. So again, I throw out to everybody, what are we doing to our generation of human beings by raising children in a minimalist environment just because we have an architectural culture of the last 100 years that has come up with these ideas of minimalism and keeps a tight grip on the design of our homes, our interiors, our schools, our kindergartens to impose this minimalism. Well, there have been debates. So far, we are losing the debates because of the invested power of the minimalist architectural establishment that will do anything in order to keep doing what it's practicing. However, there are some breakthroughs now. Anne is involved in the visual attention scanning, which is the eye tracking. We can see eye tracking and we can immediately see where a person looks without any control. This is totally unconscious. When we look at something, and of course, with unconscious control, we pick the patterns, we pick the, the primordial patterns that the children are attracted to, what I have been describing at the beginning of my talk. There is no conscious decision. This occurs in the first 3 to 5 seconds. So we have the actual eye tracking apparatus, which 30 years ago was cumbersome and you could not use it except in the laboratory. Now you just wear a pair of glasses and it shows you exactly where you are. You can be outside and these are wonderful. You can plot this, and even better, we have the software, the visual simulation software that you don't even need to wear the eyeglasses. You just have a picture and you run the software, and the software will give you a 90% accuracy of where the eye is going to look. So we are doing this with Anne. Of course, we need money in order to be able to do this research. This is pioneering research, okay? And we see that the human is attracted to the patterns that we have found in nature. The primordial patterns attract us and we connect to those and they enhance our life. And there's a separate set of experiments that show that our health is enhanced. Healing in hospitals is enhanced. You spend a fewer days in the hospital room after an operation if you have this visual stimulation from the natural patterns. And you need, say, 25% fewer painkillers. This is in the medical literature that is open to anyone and is ignored only by the architectural establishment. So the visual scans now, these are recent, like 1 or 2 years. So the visual scans enable us to plot the subliminal reality of our environment. So we look around and we see all sorts of information, but when you scan the world, then you see that most of it is empty, because our minimalist architecture that we're spending billions of dollars on is empty. We cannot look at it. The human brain is not evolved to look at this architecture. It is totally useless. It is a waste of money, and it could be doing tremendous damage to our children if you have children in this environment. This is obvious, okay? So we are going around the world, giving talks, doing scans, publishing professional papers. Architecture is retreating like the ostrich, hiding its head in the sand because they want to continue what they have been doing. And the worst part of all of this is architectural education, which for 100 years has been training young architects to deny the patterns that are necessary for human intellectual development, and to deny the same patterns which in adults give you a healthy feedback and increase human well-being and health. Now, this is nothing short of criminal. And yet money is going from well-intentioned sources to support this type of a teaching architecture that is turning out architects who will design minimalist environments. So I don't know how stronger I can make this, but for the first time now, we have the visual attention scans that just show you a picture. It's like looking at the TV screen. You see the subliminal reality. You see where you look at, where the interest is, where the healing environment is. And also it gives you the cues of how to fix the alien environments that we're erecting all over the place. So do we want to improve human health and humankind, or do we want to continue totally misguided and a way of building the environment just because somebody said so 100 years ago that this is fashionable and modern? I think it's time to burst this bubble and start to create a healing environment. Okay, that's all I want to say.
Nikos, that was wonderful. I'll share my screen. Thank you for this fantastic introduction. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, well, what Nikos was talking about is just a great build up to what I'll present next. What I'll show you next is some of the science. What I'm going to show you right here is eye tracking, a famous monument that many people may know of, Palladio's Villa Rotunda, Villa Capra, that was copied 1,000 times. And now we can actually see, using biotech tools, how people actually look at it. This woman is looking at a screenshot, and what she's doing is she doesn't know what she's doing, but I can now get inside her head and watch how her eyes focused in fixations. Those are the big yellow circles, 45 times in 15 seconds. And I can track with the lines, those are called saccades, where she went from one place to the other. And this is the kind of technology that's basically designing everything in our world right now. It's used by business schools, it's used by advertisers, it's used by website developers to basically see how the visual data gets into your brain. Here's another picture, here's another person. You can see here, like your mom said, everybody looks at the world a little differently. You can see she's looking a little differently. This is using iMotion software used by tech companies, by car companies. And it's showing exactly how she's looking at the building and how she's taking it in. And then what you can do, if the people who do this are really into statistics, so they'll get 30 to 39 people to look at one thing, and then they'll be able to do data like this. The TTFF is very important in this kind of work. That's time to first fixation, where people looked on average, and then where they looked second, third, fourth, fifth. You can kind of generate all this data. And it's very, very powerful if you're designing a book cover, if you're designing, let's say, the Kellogg's cereal box. You need to know where people look because decisions are made very, very quickly. This is the kind of software that's basically designing our world to make us, the sad part is, it's making us consume more. It's not being used to build better built environments. And what Nikos and I really want to do is try to get some of this science into the public realm. So you're building better schools, better places for people. This is the setup that we had. This was actually a study we did 5 years ago. We use the iMotion software here on their website. They say Honda, BMW, and GM use this software. And this was basically the setup with the person in the back. She has a little eye tracker on the little tripod, and that's following her eye movements. And then there's a little camera that was actually following her facial expressions. The companies that have money, like the car companies, they'll measure all kinds of things: your eyes, your facial expressions, how often you smile, your heart rate, your brain waves, to determine if you want to approach or avoid something. So you can basically understand the human visceral experience and emotional experience before a product is made. That's the new world of biology we are in. It's called the age of biology, in fact, by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They renamed our century the age of biology now, because you can now understand things so much better, humans so much better. Let me just go pretty quickly here. And so this is the software that Nikos was talking about, visual attention software. You don't even need a lab now. You can, even if you have Photoshop, you'll have a plugin for this. You can actually upload any image, and in less than 30 seconds, it spits out where algorithmically they predict humans will look in the first 3 to 5 seconds. That's pre-attentive processing. You have to understand human vision happens in 2 phases. The first is subliminal, and then the second is where you're more conscious of what you're looking at. And so this is quite interesting for me. I was always fascinated by Villa Rotunda. Why was it so popular? Makes no sense to me. Why did George Washington pick an architect who'd done a building like this to do the White House? Why did that facade of the White House? Why is that on every $20 bill? It makes no sense. Well, then you start getting different ideas when you start doing the software, because you see, oh my gosh, it looks a little bit like a face, you see. So subliminally, when people look at it, they think the building's looking at them. That's what's going on. So the big idea, what the car companies are doing, what the tech companies are doing, people like Apple, who normally hire numbers of PhD neuroscientists every year, what they're doing is they know the unconscious brain drives conscious behavior. Freud noticed this, almost 100 years ago. The mind is like an iceberg. It floats with 1/7 of its bulk above water. That's actually a really big idea. The idea is the unconscious presets what we consciously do. And that's basically because our brain hasn't changed for 40,000 years. It's an artifact of evolution. Unconscious really matters. And that's why the car companies, the tech companies, the business schools use this to manipulate people. And this is not to get into the weeds too much here. There's now information theory to really use to understand the brain and nervous system. Really big ideas here, that the human brain sends 11 million bits. A bit is a unit of information to the brain, the human brain and body, to the brain for processing. And the conscious mind seems to be able to only process 50 bits per second. It's basically even less, we're less conscious than even Freud thought, okay? So 11 million bits are going into your brain, but only 50 are conscious. You understand? So you understand now why the car companies and the tech companies are all using this technology to totally understand what your unconscious is doing, so they can manipulate your conscious reaction. And this idea of really understanding human experience is a big change in the 21st century. So Harvard Business School, imagine, you go to Harvard Business School now, you will take classes on emotional intelligence. Hello? When I went to architecture school in the 20th century at UCLA in the 1980s, or 1990s actually, emotion was never mentioned. The word emotion is never mentioned on the current licensing exam. But you go to business school now, you learn that it's the emotionally intelligent bosses that are most successful. You learn words like empathy. I mean, this is a different way of thinking about who we are and how we function. And so what does it mean, this new age of biology for architecture? Well, it's fascinating as an architect. For me, I can now actually see the impact of every one of my of windows when I put it on a building. So in this case, this is the City of New York library, and the City of New York actually paid for this study, where we eye-tracked how someone looked at a library they recently renovated. And then we we photoshopped out the windows and looked at how the way they viewed the library changed. It's kind of astonishing to us. We didn't tell them what to do, and they didn't even know they were doing this. It's kind of amazing, right? But the brain subliminally, just like Freud said, is not going to let them look when there isn't the detailing. You see what happens? So you suddenly understand, oh my gosh, when I put on windows, I'm going to change the behavior that someone will have in front of the library.
So, Anne?
Yeah.
So that asks the question, what does the brain ask the eyes to do when looking at a modernist or a planar building?
Steve, you will see. You've got it. Here, I'll get to that. Okay. You've predicted the next set of slides. I'll show you. It's really pretty interesting. I was stunned that arranging windows like this would have such an impact. Because when I've asked about 1,000 people this question. Let's say you want to wait for me while I park the car. You're going to wait with the books. Do you want to wait in front of the building on the left or the building on the right? Where do you think people want to wait, Steve?
The building on the right.
Yep, that's what happens 1,000 times. And they don't know why, but I know why. Because subliminally, they can attach to that building more, and that soothes their nervous system. Okay, and it gets a little weedy here, but you can then do we did 30 people looking at the one on the left, 30 people on the right, and that was fascinating to us, is that by 12 seconds, people are looking beyond the building when it doesn't have windows. When it has those arched windows, their brain lets them look a lot beyond the building, but then they immediately look back at it. Unbelievable. And then that subliminal behavior will determine where they want to sit and wait for me. It's pretty interesting. Which is preferable here, another study. This is Somerville, Mass. This is actually on the left, a pretty new a carport that was built, a parking garage. On the right, we decided to put in some fractals like Nikos was talking about, some fractal images. Where do you think people will look? Given
On
these,
the right.
Exactly, and this stunned us. We did this a pilot study here, only with about 12 people. What stunned us is when you put the fractals on, their brain does not let them look down the street. Do you see the difference? Absolutely amazing. And then it gets even crazier. The big tech companies can afford to do bigger research where they actually measure how many times people smile. You can have a camera and you can measure how many times the eyebrows go up and the lips go up in a smile. And in this case, you see this is a bar graph, only like 4 people smiled out of 11 people in this 14-second interval. But 11 different people, look at this, without even knowing what they were doing, subliminally, they smiled 3 times. Isn't that amazing? And when you smile, you release oxytocin, the hugging hormone, you feel better. So just by designing this building, we can now predict that people will be healthier walking past it. Isn't that amazing? And you can do this before the building's actually built. It's absolutely amazing. So we can predict all these kinds of behaviors. And as Nikos was saying too, we can now really see what the brain prioritizes subliminally. So here's a new building again in New York City. Queens Library, Flushing. Where do you think people will look? Where are people going to look? It's a new library. It's designed for people.
I don't know.
You don't know. Good answer. You know where they look? This is what's mind-blowing to me. They looked at the girl in the yoga pose.
That's what I was going to say. They look at the advertising next to the building.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And then they looked, there was a white bus there, that was a big contrast, but basically all the black dots are on the people. It's really amazing. So they've designed at public expense a building that the brain does not want to look at. And then this is a very famous building, IMP. It was originally called the Hancock Tower. It recently changed hands. It's now 200 Clarendon. After it changed hands, the new owners decided to celebrate it and put a big art graphic of a man floating down a barge on the Hancock Tower. Where do you think people looked? I'll let you know.
At the graphic.
That's exactly right. And that made the cover of Planning magazine. They went to Trinity Church first. They basically ignored the tower, but then they kept looking back at the graphic. It's pretty wild. So what you learn is what Nikos was actually saying, and with the way he started his talk quite brilliantly, we're just hardwired to look for people. And you really start to see it. And some artists, I think, have picked up on it through time. Giuseppe Arcimboldo, his works in the Louvre. And there you go. So it's really interesting. It's harder to make this out as a face. You can make it out. But this, you can make it out immediately. And the reason you can do that is because the human brain devotes more area to face recognition than the recognition of any other visual object. Nobel Prize winning Eric Kandel will explain that to you. But what he also explains really well is the template for the face upright is already in the brain, but it's not for the face upside down. So it takes your brain longer to process the visual image of the face upside down. Right. And so this is what's so a little bit scary to me is the big businesses know this, but nobody else does. The guys at Amazon know exactly which book cover works because they know how many people click on which kind of cover. The number one thing that people click on is the human face. The number two thing is a pet face. So after my first book was published, Cognitive Architecture, I eye-tracked it. Where did people look? Exactly where the science said. Amazon, very, very successful company. What does it look like? Suggests a face, right? Car designers know this. They build to it. In cars in 2007, there was an article in Wall Street Journal, cars got angrier. And they definitely are looking angrier and more fierce because car companies study this. They have to, because they know people aren't logical, they're biological. All right. And computer scientists are really into this because they're designing robots and they want robots to help us. So they have to understand how we work. So this picture is actually from a computer science journal. And the guy writes, the perception of faces is more critical than previously thought for how humans perceive the aesthetics of the environment and the architecture of house facades and the buildings they are surrounded by in their day-to-day lives. This is amazing. These are robot designers really understanding architecture better than most architects. All right. And so then this is, you can apply the VAST software, the visual attention software that Nikos talked about, to art, and you suddenly understand how great artists, one reason they're great is they intuit exactly what we need to see. Mona Lisa, up until COVID, 8 million people went to see her every year at the Louvre. And when you eye track it, it's quite interesting. 85% will immediately go to the face, then to the hands, then back to the face again. And then here we are with Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. 400 years later, I hate to break it to you guys, we haven't changed how we look at things. I mean, this kind of surprised me because I thought people would look at the nude bodies. It's not how we work. We went straight for the faces. It's really interesting. And then, yeah.
And a couple of questions have come along about the golden mean and other mathematical ratios.
Let me finish this and we'll take that up. That's a really important question.
Okay.
It's a really important question about how we look at the world, and in a way, our perception, our visual portal is rectangular. And so we'll talk about that. But let me just finish this. So I think this is pretty interesting. So even a nude lady, you look at the face first. And then when you look at architecture, this totally changed how you see architecture. No wonder, there are so many faces and statues in traditional building. Look, this is the Middle Ages. This is Salamanca, Spain. This is now a World Heritage Site. And here we have the 12 apostles looking down at you. Well, of course, the 12 apostles would be looking down at you. You would subliminally, now we understand subliminally in the Middle Ages, people were illiterate except for the clergy. They'd need to see the apostles looking at them. They would bond to them. It makes perfect sense, this design. You now can understand why humans created architecture like this, now that we understand our biology better. And now then, here's an Apple store in 2013, the 12 apostles at Apple. It's in Greater Boston, where people are, I'd say, 95% literate, but they're doing the exact same design. Exact same. Because what happens when you see faces looking at you, oxytocin is released and you tend to move forward deeper into the store. Apple knows that. Remember, neuroscientists drive the design of all their store interiors. This is the different Apple store 5 years later. Exact same design strategy, different iPhone. Okay, so why do you think our brain unconsciously prioritizes seeing people all the time? Any answers? Nikos? Steve?
I was muted. You have the floor, Anne. You have to give answers.
Okay, well, I'd say it's survival.
Well, I was going to say because that's the first thing we bond with is the mother's face.
That's it. That's the first thing we bond with, and there's a survival thing. And because, as Nikos mentioned, humans are the most primitive and unprepared mammal at birth, they need to have that really intense attachment for survival. It just wouldn't work. You can take, and this is something else, you can take the person out of the Stone Age, but you can't take the Stone Age out of the person. Interestingly enough, this is a quote from an article in Harvard Business Review that appeared 20 years ago. So they've been into how human design is hardwired for a long while at business schools. Okay, so then the last 5 minutes of my talk here, I'll talk just briefly about how did modern architecture happen. This is something I was long curious about. Why did buildings become blank and faceless and not there? How did that happen? Because it really is pretty strange given our face bias. And on the left, you have a building in Cambridge in Harvard Square. On the right, a building again in New York, a new library in Queens. And when you do the visual eye tracking study with the VAST, the visual attention software, what you see is that subliminally, the brain basically does not look at the new building. It will look at the fire hydrant, it'll look at the book drop, and then the edge condition on the left. Whereas the building on the left, the carriage house, it takes in the windows and sees where the door is immediately. So you have to answer this question: who are the fathers of modern architecture? You suddenly understand they're all born about the same time, basically the last 15 years of the 19th century. They all died about the same time in the late 1960s. Okay. And when they were about 30 or the late 20s, they experienced, as young adults, World War I. In a way, we're talking now about World War I more. We just passed the centenary in 2018, and PBS did a great series on it called The Great War. And one of their conclusions is the impact of World War I is contemporary. I could not agree more. The impact of World War I is contemporary. And what you see now, in fact, what's interesting too, I've been reading about this, is that the British definitely used art to promote the war, and they actually sent John Singer Sargent, an American painter, to the front in 1917 to paint and to draw American and British soldiers together. And then after the war was over, he did this painting, which then toured the United States in 2018. It was pretty amazing. I saw it in Nashville. It's called Gassed. And this is the first tanks came from World War I. And here is one of the early watercolors of tanks. Amazing. And so what's the point here? Well, so now, again, part of the 21st century paradigm shift in understanding our biology is now we understand the impact of war differently. We now can say more than 20% of the soldiers suffered from PTSD in World War I. 10 million soldiers died. These numbers were increased by Jay Winter, a professor emeritus of Yale, who really wanted to study what the cost of World War I was. A lot of it was buried for a lot of reasons, but because World War II happened so quickly afterwards. But more than 20% of the soldiers suffer from PTSD. And now, and this is what's absolutely astonishing now we have technology called magnetic resonance imaging, where you can actually look into the brain and then see how a veteran's brain is different after trauma. So the brain on the right, PTSD, it has shrunk. Neurons have died, and that will mean the person will perceive reality differently. So you can actually now do brain scans that show how your brain has changed because of trauma. That's huge. That really didn't come on until about 20 years ago. That's really amazing. Okay, so now we know PTSD rewires the brain, and it can keep you stuck in the past subliminally without you realizing it. Okay, a big book that was really important in this was Bessel van der Kolk's. He's a doctor, The Body Keeps the Score. It came out in 2014. And what he says is really important. What we express externally reflects what he calls the structure of our inner world, because reality is a construct between our eye and brain. Not only the way we live, but the way we build reflects hidden internal brain design that we may not know we carry, but unconsciously are always responding to. So on the right is Bessel's book. If you want to understand how trauma changes your family, I definitely recommend it. And on the left is the new book, Urban Experience and Design. Nikos and I both have contributed to this book. It just came out in 2021. So now when I teach at the Boston Architecture College. I talk about Gropius's PTSD is in his architecture. If you want to understand what trauma does to the brain in World War I, you need to see Gropius's house. This is in Lincoln, about 6 miles from where I am now, in Lincoln, Massachusetts, about 20 miles from Cambridge. And he modeled his house that we built in the 1930s, not unlike a bunker. This is a bunker on the right that's now a historic site. They preserved it and they allowed trees to grow up around it because the bodies of World War I soldiers are still buried underneath it. Gropius means Neuter, we're all World War I vets with PTSD. Okay, PTSD become disembodied, and so do your buildings. So the house directly opposite Gropius's house is the one on the left. And you can see it's very inviting. You can find the front door. It kind of looks like it's looking at you. The one at the right, when you visit this house, it's now owned by a New England nonprofit. When you visit it, they tell a story about a woman driving up and looking for the gas pump. She didn't even think it was a house, right?
There is a Gropius dormitory at Harvard Law School, as you may know, which has 8-foot ceilings made out of concrete. It is not any student's first choice of a place to live. But it looks very much like the house on the right. And
Right.
it's preserved Harvard Law School would love to get rid of it, but it's a historic monument. It's an architectural monument. It was done by Gropius. They can't tear it down.
Right. Right. Well, and now you understand, in a way you have compassion. Now that you understand more how neuroscience works, you have compassion. And, you know, you can understand he was disembodied, and his architecture displayed his disembodiment. And the other thing that's fascinating too, they've really noticed this now with vets coming down, home from recent wars that America's had overseas. You lose the ability to process visual detail. So I could never understand why detail up until my architecture up until like the 1930s always had so much detail, whereas modern architecture lost it because the people who created modern architecture couldn't see the detail. Okay? And this is what's stunning too. So he recreated in his first floor office a trench, exact same section. You could only see out standing up, and the same very, you know, efficient way of storing things in unornamented shelving below, exactly like on a trench. And then this is mind-blowing to me. His bedroom upstairs is laid out exactly like a dugout. Dugouts were the trench sleeping quarters where the men slept behind a very sturdy corridor wall in the trench wall. So what Gropius did, what his brain had him do, is design a corridor on the second floor of his house that would be his bedroom room. And then in it, there'd be another doorway just where the sleeping quarter would be. It's absolutely amazing. I showed this to an instructor at Harvard Medical School, and he said to me, "Anne, this is exactly how trauma works. Trauma stays in the right hemisphere, the nonverbal hemisphere, and then continually gets replayed." So this is his deck facing the street, has a huge wall on it, so nobody could see him from the road. And then the interior wall construction mirrors the kind of randomness of trench construction. They recently rebuilt, actually, they built a new trench at a museum not far from here, and at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Mass. And there's a randomness in the way trench construction is built, and a randomness kind of in modern architecture. And when you understand, when you're in terror, you turn to random means. That's what happens. He was subliminally still in terror.
And let me remind you of the time.
Yeah, I'm just about done. I'm done in 2 minutes. Modern architecture is a direct expression of trauma of World War I trench. This was presented at a medical conference in Boston in 2019. And it's also in the new book, Cognitive Architecture, second edition, that comes out in July. So it's a new way of the way because it's a paradigm shift, we now understand how humans work. We now can reframe how architecture happened. All right, what about Le Corbusier? I'll be pretty quick here. They knew biographies of him talk about him as autistic. And that is actually quite important, because now when you do eye tracking with someone on autism, you understand they don't see the world the same way. They're subliminally, they take in the world differently. A neurotypical person looks right at the eyes, whereas someone who is on the autism spectrum avoids looking at eyes. There's a lot about this on the internet. All right. So there you see on the right is someone on the autism spectrum looking at the library without windows in New York City. On the left, neurotypical people, 30 neurotypical people, their brain won't let them look at the blankness. All right, this is Le Corbusier's National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo. Le Corbusier's autism is in his architecture. How did modern architecture happen? Relationally compromised people with atypical subliminal fixations came up with it, abetted by a wounded world that was eager to bury the past and an economic power for structure all too willing to profit from it. That's what happened. Impact of World War I, architecture becomes avoidant. It's an external expression of damaged internal brain structure. All right. So understanding nature's patterns in design, to conclude, helps us see what we're built to see and need to see as a social species. These are all houses and churches in Greater Boston. Most of them are now protected by historic bylaws. You cannot tear these buildings down. Okay. Nature's patterns of designs, our internal brain architecture sets the parameters for external built architecture. I'll just briefly review the learning objectives here. Explain the importance of the human unconscious in our perception of art and architecture. See how biometric modeling, including eye tracking, can be used as a tool to assess design and why that's so powerful. Demonstrate the extent the human brain is oriented to vision, hardwired to look at faces, both human and inanimate, and understand the reality is a construct between eye and brain, and how traditional architecture is an external representation of healthy brain and evolutionary biases. I believe this is it. Oh, these are the books. This one on the left, Nikos and I both have chapters in. urban experience and design. It's taking new understandings about fractals, but also about from neuroscience and applying them to reassess architectural history. Cognitive Architecture second edition has 70 pages of eye-tracked architecture in full color, so you can better understand how human perception of architecture happens. Okay, and I'll say briefly about our new Human Architecture and Planning Institute. Our mission is to promote evidence-based design using biometric and other tools to reveal hidden aspects of the human experience that direct our behavior. We really want to build healthy environments for people. Thank you, and stay curious.
All right, and we have a number of interesting questions, but I'm going to start with an amusing one, and that is from one of our viewers. If Gropius had PTSD, what did Frank Gehry have?
Well, I think what happened is, I mean, I was educated, I went to architecture school for over a couple of years, and we were educated in a false paradigm. And Frank Gehry grew up and worked in LA, and he was very much in a car culture, and he realized to get a building to attract attention, it'd be good if it swooped from a distance, right? And so he was all about, I mean, he was very cagey, but he was elaborated on a paradigm that's false. It's not evidence-based, whereas architecture up until World War I always was. And people, and Frank Gehry knows nothing about biology. He's never taken a psychology class. He's never done any preference testing.
Okay, why don't we jump back to the question about ratios?
Do you want to pose that again, or do you want Nikos to take
Well,
that?
for either of you actually, but where does the golden mean and other mathematical ratios fit into all of this?
Yes, well, I have a clear answer. I have written a 50-page paper called the golden mean, applications of the golden mean in architecture. If you look under that title, under my name, there is a free version on the internet. And to summarize it in 30 seconds, special rectangles are not very important. What is important is the Fibonacci sequence that shows you smaller and smaller and smaller numbers, and those correspond to the sizes of the fractals, that you have smaller and smaller and smaller components of a fractal, just like we have in a traditional building, just like we have in nature. And the Fibonacci sequence will give you pretty accurately the size, because you cannot have just any size. It has to be very precise scaling sizes. So that's the short of it. There is no magic rectangle. You know, any rectangle can be good. What's important is the scaling.
Okay, fair enough. But for you, Anne, you did show Palladio's famous villa, and obviously Palladian architecture is often referred to as the progenitor of the golden mean in architecture.
Right, I think that's really important, but I think what you have to understand is human perception. So it's like it is rectangular, and that when things are of a certain size, it's faster for us to process them. So as Nikos was saying, it's bilaterally symmetrical around a vertical axis. It's fast processing. It's really interesting. My cat can see 210. See, cats see differently, but we see 180. And so that, I think the interest in rectangles matters because it has to do with faster visual processing.
Well, okay, on a completely different subject, we have one of our viewers has asked this question. I'm going to read it word for word so I get it right. How much do you think the gaze behavior is based on the context? Would we choose to neglect a fractal in some case where predicting that fractal is easier than to actually acquire that information by moving our eyes?
I will take a crack at that. We don't choose anything. Our brain and eye system have evolved to instantly take in this information, because when we do, we guarantee our survival, or our ancestors guaranteed the survival. So we don't choose anything. After several seconds, then we can think about what to choose to look at.
That's exactly, Nikos is exactly right. He's exactly right. That's okay. The scary thing when you do these biometric analyses, you realize, oh my gosh, Nature trusts us, but not that much. She's deciding where we're going to look.
All right.
And the face bias is so built in. It's amazing. You know, and it's why when you walk down the cereal aisle, the Raisin Bran will have a smiling sun just below the title Raisin Bran. Why? Because subliminally, they have to get your attention very, very quickly. There are 500 packages that are competing, right? So they want a big smile. Subliminally, they know you will see it fast, more likely pick it up.
Okay, we have a couple of comments from a couple of viewers. One about why we may have more modern buildings in our midst than you would prefer, maybe. Who said there was also the effect in the 20th century of tuberculosis. Sleek finishes collected less dust. This deeply influenced modern architecture.
I would argue against that. It was the image of sleekness and polished metal that looked cleaner. In fact, laboratory experiments show that microbes grow just as well on polished metal surfaces. That's an old misconception from the 1910s. Okay, so as long as you keep disinfectant, most surfaces, unless you have a surface that's very porous, and the microbes can go to the middle of it, most surfaces have the same antiseptic qualities. Now, what is important is a lot of sunlight, because sunlight does have antiseptic qualities. So one thing that the modernists got right by having many windows, in fact, too many windows, well, you know, the sunlight actually has disinfectant qualities, and that was important in fighting tuberculosis. But in my estimation, that's about the only thing that got right.
All right. All right. Another viewer commented that there are two buildings going up in New York City, one on York and 86th and one on Madison between 79th and 80th. Both have paned windows, arches, limestone facades, pediments. I think some architects are waking up.
Well,
Anne, do you think architects are waking up, Anne?
This is what I see in my students, that I think we're in a different time in 2021. People are talking about stress, and people are talking about emotions. They get that now. And so, yes, I'm also seeing that if an architect's just going to put another glass block building up, they're not going to get any attention. They're seeing that. So I think there is some interest. I think the issue is the financial business of building is very, very expensive and costly. And that's basically, it doesn't know how to take in health yet.
Question here for
Steve, let me jump in.
Sure.
I run with the pack of architects who really design and build beautiful buildings. Every one of them tells their story. They had to learn the design techniques on their own. It was impossible to learn in architecture school. So they had to reinvent all of this on their own, or find it from pieces of the past, or reinvent it. So what you're seeing now is very positive, but it is a do-it-yourself. People really have to train themselves, because that material is not being taught. And that's the great shame of what's happening.
Okay, I'll read another one. Is there such a thing as a bad fractal pattern or too much pattern? Thinking of late 19th century design reformers' opposition to trompe l'oeil and 3D flat patterns, does the brain differentiate from human-generated patterns that are explicitly biomimetic and patterns directly experienced in nature?
Well, I can try a stab at this. When you look at nature, everything is highly complex and highly organized. However, humans can make a mess of it, because humans can try to ornament something and they say, well, you know, a little ornament really makes it nice. So let me add more, and I'll add more and more, and, you know, and lay it on like icing on the cake with a spatula. Well, it loses the coherence. And if you lose the coherence, it might as well be minimalist. It becomes random. Okay, so that's what happened. You go to Europe and you see a Romanesque church, which was perfect. And then some pope decided in the 19th century, to put a piece of rococo in. Well, it ruined it because, already it was just perfectly balanced. You put in more stuff, it makes it detracts from the coherence.
And Richard asks, can you actually design a building consciously to have these properties, given that so much of what we see or think is subliminal?
Well, I think you can. Now that we understand why traditional architecture works, now we know why.
I think you've said people are designing that.
Yeah,
to that end.
certainly you can. And in the end, though, it's going to end up, I think, it's not that we can't be more innovative. You have to respect nature's systems. She's been a designer for about 3.8 billion years. She's very strong, and you've got to respect her systems. And when we're thinking about sustainability, you really should look at how things feel and respect that.
I would like to answer that question too. It is technology that will save humanity from its own stupidity. Because so today we can have our split screen computer and we can be designing with the software on the right-hand side, and we have the VAS checking what's happening on the left-hand side. So you draw in a window, you can adjust the window and you see the effect it will have, but you need to have that subliminal reality that the visual attention software is showing you. We can do that today. So you can be juxtaposing and jumping between the obvious reality and the subliminal reality, and you can make a marvelous design today.
What do you both see for the architect of tomorrow? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I think there's an incredible opportunity to learn. And I think, with COVID and everything, people are really interested in health. And we're also interested in sustainability. And so understanding human perception, how it works, how stress happens, how stress connects to loneliness, to how we feel, to our health, it's all connected. The more we appreciate nature's systems, the better design we will have. There's a famous Steve Jobs quote, the better our understanding of the human experience, the better design we will have. And I think he's basically right.
Okay, and my answer is we have a revolution in scientific data that will help towards a human architecture. If the majority of the schools are ignoring this, then they are just too way behind the times, and individual architects are picking this up on their own. So the architect of tomorrow will be self-trained to take advantage of this marvelous technology and this marvelous scientific advances that will create a human scale environment that's healing for human beings and users.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Ann.
I think after the war, as a product of the 50s, there was this idea that we could be modern. And then when, we just bought into it, DDT on crops and, everybody in a car. And now we're starting to understand, hold on, guys, it's not quite going to work that way. We're in a closed system. Nature has her ways of working. And if this idea of being modern doesn't really work, and we have to accept that and embrace what we really are.
May I put in something, Steve?
Yeah.
Yeah, as everyone here knows, the National Civic Arts Society did a study of what people want in federal office buildings. And the enormous majority of Americans wanted traditional architecture, independent of whether they were young or old, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. They still preferred the traditional architecture. And I think no one's going to quarrel with that study and say there was something wrong with the study, because we know that that's what people prefer. The only school in the country, the only architecture school in the country that teaches traditional architecture, it's as its major study, and Nikos and I are in this tribe, is the University of Notre Dame. And every single graduate has a job upon graduation, because that's what human beings like. And that's the way we are. And I don't think they do eye tracking. I think we just know which building we're going to stand in front of to wait. Well, we know which one. It's going to be that traditional building. Thanks, Steve. Thank you all.
All right, with that, we're about out of time, even though there were more questions and comments that we had time to get to. But I'd like to thank Ann Sussman and Nikos Salingaros for a really interesting talk, stimulating, and thank you all viewers for being here today with us at the National Arts Club. We look forward to meeting you one day soon at the clubhouse. Thank you all and good night.